Boa tarde, pessoal.
Ainda não está aparecendo.
Não? Boa tarde, pessoal. Meu nome é professor Anand Rebelo e, no nome da direção do Instituto de Computação, eu gostaria de desejar a vocês boas-vindas para o novo semestre dos Seminários do IC da UF. Mas antes de começar, gostaria de agradecer primeiro aos organizadores, em particular, professores Daniel e Simone, para o trabalho de coordenar toda a logística para organizar esses palestras online. E, obviamente, agradecer também nossos palestrantes e convidados, tanto do semestre passado quanto do atual. Hoje vamos abrir esse novo ciclo de seminários com uma apresentação inaugural intitulada Fighting COVID-19 Using Cellular Network Data, de uma colaboração internacional de pesquisa, cujos resultados já foram destaques em jornais internacionais de notícias lá fora. Parabéns, então, para nossa professora Antônio Augusto, Antônio Augusto Guto, e seus parceiros, professores Arti e Ramesh e Anand Seetharam, da Universidade Estadual de Nova York, na Binghamton, nos Estados Unidos. Então, vou passar batom para Antônio Guto, para fazer essa primeira palestra, nossa segundo semestre de 2020. Guto.
Muito obrigado, Vino, pela introdução. Como vocês perceberam, a gente tem 2 convidados internacionais, então eu vou mudar para inglês, para eles saberem um pouquinho da introdução, mas a apresentação vai acontecer uma parte em português, uma parte em inglês, porque a gente vai dividir entre nós 3. So, guys, Anand, Art, again, thank you very much for being with us today. It's a really great pleasure to have you in this opening session of our seminars in our semester. Anand and Art, they are very close friends of mine, and we are going to present here a joint work that we are having done during this, let's say, terrible moment that we are living for the COVID that the world is basically having to deal with. So, Anand, Art, thank you very much.
Thanks, Guru.
Yeah, thank you for having us over.
Okay, so I will start the talk, and then we're going to move to Art and Anand. So, mais uma vez, boa tarde a todos. Como eu disse, essa apresentação vai acontecer em 2 línguas diferentes. A gente terminou definindo o que seria mais interessante para o público, dado que a grande maioria do público aqui presente fala português, porque é o seminário de abertura do nosso semestre. Queria aproveitar também e dar boas-vindas a todos por pelo início do semestre. Temos todos um semestre bastante produtivo. E essa apresentação é de um conjunto de trabalhos que eu venho desenvolvendo com alguns professores e outros alunos, Arti, Ramesh e Anand Seetharam. Eles são da Universidade Estadual de Nova York, em Binghamton, e eu sou professor da Universidade Federal Fluminense, do Instituto de Computação. Esse trabalho a gente tem. Essa palestra é intitulada Fighting COVID Using Cellular Network, mas ela é composta por um conjunto de outros trabalhos e artigos científicos, resultados têm sido publicados em artigos científicos. Esse trabalho também é desenvolvido em colaboração com outros alunos que a gente não pode deixar de mencionar, do Instituto de Computação, o Nilson Damasceno e Perão Souza. O Nilson é meu aluno de doutorado atualmente, Perão Souza é formando, terminou o doutorado no ano passado com a gente. E da parte da Universidade de Nova York, a gente tem outros 2 alunos, o Nekat e o Sushi, todos 2 também colaborando nessa pesquisa. Bom, então a motivação desse trabalho acontece exatamente pelo momento que a gente tem vivido, a Covid-19, uma pandemia global que trouxe, ou que tem afetado o momento, né, ou a vida do ser humano no mundo inteiro. Então, depois do surgimento dele em dezembro de 2019, ainda na China, os vírus se espalhou pelo resto do mundo de uma forma nunca vista antes, né, com rapidez e com consequências bastante severas para toda a população do mundo. Logo no início de 2020, ainda em março de 2020, a Organização Mundial de Saúde ela declarou que a COVID-19 era uma pandemia global. E aí, a partir desse momento, em alguns países, inclusive antes disso, os governos começaram a tomar algumas decisões para que essa contaminação, ou que a pandemia, né, ou que o espalhamento desse vírus fosse freado o máximo possível. Então, a gente começou a ver aí decisões por lockdown, ordem de ficar em casa, declarações de quarentena, e dentre outras ações que foram tomadas, né, pelas decisões ou pelas administrações públicas para tentar conter essa pandemia, né, esse espalhamento do vírus. Só para a gente ilustrar um pouco disso, se a gente for comparar, por exemplo, o dia 27 de março de 2019, partindo do aeroporto de Heathrow, foram 1.815 voos. 2 semanas, ou um pouco mais de uma semana depois da Organização Mundial de Saúde declarar a pandemia global por conta do Covid-19, nesse mesmo aeroporto, apenas 525 voos decolaram dele em direção a outros países, né, ou outras regiões. Se a gente for considerar, por exemplo, o nível de nitrogênio na camada mais baixa da atmosfera, né, a gente pode ver aí na cidade de Milão, em janeiro de 2019 e janeiro de 2020, uma quantidade bem grande dessa substância, né, que reflete ali um pouco da contaminação, né, da poluição urbana, né. Quando a gente passa para o mês de março de 2019, a gente ainda vê esse nível de poluição. Quando a gente passa para março de 2020, a gente percebe a redução que aconteceu desse nível de poluição por conta do isolamento social, né, e da mudança no comportamento da sociedade devido à pandemia. Ainda esse mesmo tipo de comportamento a gente tem vivido até hoje, né, por conta do problema não ter sido resolvido até agora, né, a gente agora que começa a encontrar ali uma retomada, né, com o surgimento da vacina. Então, o que a gente vê aí é uma imagem do governo, de um estudo sobre os governos ou decisões dos governos ao redor do mundo, sobre quão restrito está a locomoção das pessoas no dia 25 de janeiro, né? Então, quanto mais azul escuro, mais restrito está a decisão, quanto mais para azul claro e amarelo, né, menos restrito está as decisões quanto ao governo. Então, a conclusão que a gente pode perceber é que, basicamente, o mundo tem parado ou mudado por conta da pandemia, né? Uma das principais consequências disso é a redução da mobilidade. Então, entender essa mobilidade vai trazer para a gente a compreensão sobre como os efeitos das decisões da administração pública estão impactando no comportamento da sociedade. Então, o problema definido aqui nesse trabalho, né, ele passa por alguns objetivos, né, como, por exemplo, o desenvolvimento de uma ferramenta que pudesse auxiliar a população e a própria administração pública a analisar a mobilidade dos indivíduos, né, e correlacionar essa mobilidade com os números de infecções ou casos de Covid identificados pelo governo. É também um outro objetivo tentar analisar e discutir quais são os efeitos ou a efetividade dessas decisões do governo em relação à pandemia. E também tentar desenvolver modelos, né, ou abordagens que ajudem as autoridades resolver, né, ou tentar lidar com o problema da contaminação do COVID. Então, esses foram os problemas colocados por nós diante dessa colaboração que a gente tentou resolver de algumas formas ou propunha algumas soluções e abordagens que vão ser apresentadas para vocês aqui. Né? Antes de dar continuidade, eu gostaria de falar um pouco também das colaborações. Além da colaboração entre a Universidade Federal Fluminense e a Universidade do Estado de Nova York, né, a gente tem algumas outras colaborações que não seriam possíveis se não fossem, se não existissem. A primeira delas é a operadora TIM. Ela ofereceu um conjunto de dados anonimizado das conexões da rede celular dos seus usuários na cidade do Rio de Janeiro, que é o que a gente usa como base de análise. Né? E isso consiste de aproximadamente 1.400 antenas de celular, que dá aí aproximadamente 120 milhões de conexões por dia, feita por aproximadamente 2 milhões de usuários por dia. Isso demonstra aí a quantidade de dados, né, que a gente recebe diariamente e que precisa ser tratado para todas essas análises. E isso faz parte, inclusive, em compreender a dificuldade em lidar com essa quantidade de dados. É importante porque parte da contribuição desse trabalho vem das soluções desenvolvidas para poder lidar com esse grande volume de dados. Tá? Uma outra questão é como tratar todo esse volume de dados, né? E aí tem um outro colaborador que surge, que é a Rede Nacional de Ensino e Pesquisa, que ela provê aí um suporte computacional para armazenamento e processamento desses dados, que vão ser utilizados pela ferramenta que foi desenvolvida. Né? Então, a esses dois colaboradores, um grande agradecimento da nossa parte. Então, definida aí a motivação do trabalho, né, o resto dessa apresentação consiste em apresentar uma ferramenta que foi desenvolvida para poder permitir que sejam feitas análises como essas que a gente vai apresentar aqui. Né. Essa primeira parte vai ser apresentada por mim, uma outra parte da apresentação consiste na caracterização do modelo de mobilidade, né, durante o período de pandemia, usando os dados de redes celulares obtidos da operadora. Né? E um terceiro ponto a ser apresentado é um modelo de predição dos casos de COVID a partir daqueles dados de mobilidade humana capturados pelos dados da rede celular. E, por fim, a gente vai falar um pouquinho de alguns poucos, né, trabalhos futuros que a gente tem em mente, dos diversos que a gente pode imaginar. Então, a primeira parte, a gente vai falar desse COVID Borescope, só para dar uma ideia, né, Borescope é uma ferramenta que vem sendo desenvolvida dentro do Instituto de Computação, ela é parte desse grande projeto, ou de um projeto que é fomentado pela Rede Nacional de Ensino e Pesquisa. Lá, especificamente, o nome da ferramenta é Network Borescope, porque ela tem por objetivo analisar dados de redes de computadores, né, na verdade, do backbone da RNP. E aí, quando a gente iniciou a colaboração com a operadora de celular, né, com a TIM, o que a gente percebeu é que a gente poderia adaptar a ferramenta para começar a armazenar os dados de COVID, tanto de mobilidade quanto de infecção. E a gente vai falar um pouquinho sobre essa ferramenta agora, né, que vem sendo utilizada. Então, a ideia é que a gente conseguisse uma ferramenta que permitisse uma análise e uma comparação dos dados de celular. Né? E esses dados que a gente recebe são, na verdade, dados de conexões. E o que a gente chama de conexões? Chamadas de telefone, conexões de dados, de tráfego de dados usando 3G ou 4G, e mensagens de SMS, que hoje em dia certamente é muito menor do que as outras duas, né? E a gente, para uma primeira análise que a gente começou a fazer, né, que eu vou apresentar aqui, a gente dividiu esse conjunto de dados em 3 fases. A gente tem esses dados sendo carregados desde março, 1º de março, até os dias atuais, mas para as análises que a gente vai apresentar aqui, a gente dividiu, a gente parou em um determinado momento, né, a análise, se não me engano, são no final de julho, e a gente dividiu em 3 momentos. O momento pré-lockdown, antes de 15 de março, o momento mais estreito, restrito de lockdown, né, que consiste ali de um período após 15 de março e agosto, e o momento, e junho, e um momento após lockdown, que é o momento que a gente percebe que as coisas começam a ser flexibilizadas na cidade do Rio de Janeiro. O que a gente vê aí embaixo é um gráfico que mostra exatamente esses números de conexões nesse tempo, né, de início de março. E aqui a gente vê que tem dois tipos de dados, são dados que a gente obtém a partir de filtragens e de um mapa que é gerado pela ferramenta. Né? Para compreender um pouco melhor também as análises, a gente olhou o Rio sob uma perspectiva social, né, a partir de índices sociais, né, relacionados, por exemplo, às necessidades humanas, né, poder aquisitivo e oportunidades que aquelas regiões oferecem para a sua população, e pegou aqui as regiões censitárias do Rio de Janeiro e dividiu e tentou fazer análises direcionadas a essas regiões. O que a gente pode perceber é que esse índice social aí, ele quanto mais para vermelho é mais baixo, e quanto mais para o verde escuro é mais alta aquela região censitária da cidade do Rio de Janeiro. E o que a gente tenta é fazer uma compreensão sobre esse índice social e os números de mobilidade e números de contaminação. O dataset que a gente recebe, a gente tem aí uma série. Mais uma vez, é importante dizer que esses dados vêm completamente anonimizados, a gente não tem informação sobre o indivíduo em si, né? Mas a gente tem informações ali do instante que aquele usuário anonimizado fez algum tipo de conexão, e a gente tem também o lat-long de onde aquela conexão aconteceu. E esse lat-long é referente à antena que ele se conectou e não à posição que aquele usuário estava necessariamente, porque ele podia estar a 1 metro da antena ou a 1 quilômetro da antena. E aí esses dados, eles podem vir de duas formas, né? Ou de uma forma individual para cada usuário, ou de uma forma agregada a perspectiva da antena. Então, a gente recebe esses dados dessas duas formas, individualizado por usuário, né, da operadora, e também a partir de uma perspectiva da antena, que seria o que cada antena vê como conexão durante aquele intervalo de tempo. E aí a gente consegue identificar, por exemplo, o número de conexões que aconteceram naquela antena. Né? Bom, então essa primeira análise que a gente vai apresentar aqui, né, é uma ilustração sobre o dataset agregado, né, daquele que cada antena diz a quantidade de usuários que fizeram conexão nela. A gente está agregando todos os dados de todas as antenas aqui na cidade do Rio de Janeiro ao longo do tempo, né, no eixo X, e o número de conexões no eixo Y. E o que a gente apresenta aqui é 3 segmentos desse gráfico, né, onde o primeiro segmento aqui apresenta o período pré-lockdown, o do meio apresenta o período mais estreito do lockdown, mais restrito de lockdown, e a terceira parte ali, o período onde se começa a flexibilização do lockdown. A curva azul mostra ali o número de conexões ao longo do dia, e a gente consegue perceber perfeitamente ali uma variação temporal por questões de ser final de semana, dia de semana, né, e coisas desse tipo, porque isso daí é o agregado de um dia, né? E o que a gente apresenta isso na curva azul. Na curva vermelha, a gente também apresenta uma média móvel daquela semana. E aí o que a gente consegue perceber, a partir desse gráfico, é que claramente há uma redução no número de conexões durante o período mais estreito do lockdown, e esse número de conexões ela passa a aumentar a partir de um determinado momento, onde as coisas começam a ser flexibilizadas. Já esse segundo gráfico aqui, o que ele mostra é o dataset, uma dos exemplos de dataset individualizado, onde eu estou olhando o usuário especificamente, mais uma vez o usuário anonimizado. Então, para cada usuário anonimizado, o que eu estou olhando aqui é o número de, no eixo X, mais uma vez, os dias, né, dentro de um intervalo, né, e no eixo Y é o número de usuários distintos. Eu vou olhar para cada usuário né? Quantos usuários distintos apareceram em cada uma daquelas antenas, por exemplo, é um tipo de análise. E o que a gente também consegue perceber nessa tendência é que existe, durante um período pré-lockdown, ou de lockdown, um número mais reduzido, né, de usuários diferentes em cada antena, e num período pós-flexibilização, a gente começa a perceber que esses usuários começam a aumentar o número distinto de usuários. Isso é um reflexo do início das pessoas saindo da mobilidade, as pessoas começam a conectar essas antenas. Então, cada antena passa a ter um número maior de usuários de um dia. Bom, então, para a gente poder analisar esses grandes volumes de dados, como eu disse, a gente desenvolveu essa ferramenta, que é chamada de COVID-19 Borescope, né, que ela oferece uma arquitetura flexível, otimizada e escalável para esses grandes volumes de dados. Aqui do lado direito você vê essa imagem que representa essa arquitetura. O que a gente tem é um front-end, um servidor de front-end rodando aí em cima de um Nginx. Esse servidor de front-end oferece as funcionalidades dessa ferramenta para os usuários através de uma interface web. Os usuários acessam essa interface web e eles podem ali realizar operações naquela ferramenta. E essas operações são submetidas a esse front-end, que é pré-processada, né, e submetida ou realiza consultas a uma base de dados ou a um conjunto de bases de dados que fica no back-end. Bom, esse conjunto de bases de dados que tem aí no back-end, na verdade, é uma base de dados para cada tipo de dados que a gente tem, e é uma das contribuições aqui desse projeto, né? Esse projeto que, mais uma vez, ele é fomentado pela Rede Nacional de Ensino e Pesquisa. Uma das contribuições é exatamente uma base de dados em memory otimizada para a realização desse tipo de consulta. Eu não vou entrar em detalhes, porque isso foge um pouco com o contexto, né, dessa palestra, mas a gente consegue, em tempo real, responder a operações e enviar respostas dos usuários de um grande volume de dados, né? E quando essa resposta é retornada do back-end para o front-end, a gente ainda também pode pós-processar aquela consulta, e aí que entram as análises a serem feitas. A gente pode fazer análises do conjunto de dados, e a gente pode, por exemplo, rodar algum algoritmo de inteligência artificial, algum algoritmo de regressão linear, por exemplo, para fazer análise e apresentar esse resultado como resposta à operação da interface gráfica que é operada pelo usuário. Então, a arquitetura atual do COVID Borescope consiste de um front-end com duas bases de dados, mas essa arquitetura pode ser expandida e ter N servidores de back-end e até mais de um servidor de front-end para permitir escalabilidade. Bom, essa é a interface da ferramenta, é uma interface web, e que vocês veem aí na ferramenta, na interface, é o mapa do Rio de Janeiro, já com um zoom numa determinada região, mais especificamente a região da Barra da Tijuca, da zona oeste litorânea. Nessa interface a gente consegue realizar uma série de operações, como eu disse, como, por exemplo, clicar em cima de um bairro. E o que a gente vai ver é que, ao clicar em cima de um bairro, a gente consegue perceber o número de infecções de Covid naquele bairro, o número de pessoas recuperadas, o número de mortes naquela região. Do lado direito, a gente consegue ver essas mesmas informações, só que agregadas em todos os bairros que foram selecionados, né? E a gente consegue ver também outras informações, se a gente quiser, a partir de filtros que são oferecidos na interface e do próprio mapa, né? Daquilo que a gente está visualizando na área do mapa. E embaixo, no gráfico de baixo, que a gente consegue ver são as informações, tanto do filtro, quanto do mapa, quanto das regiões clicadas, dos números de conexão, que tem uma relação com o número de mobilidade, como a gente vai ver mais adiante em algum dos resultados. Né? Pois bem, então aqui, essa é a ferramenta que a gente tem utilizado. Além dessas funcionalidades, ela possui outras, mas, assim, para a gente não fugir ou ficar apenas falando um pouco da ferramenta, quem tiver interesse, a gente pode mostrar ou fazer demonstrações mais adiante, mas a partir de agora a gente vai falar um pouco de outras análises mais específicas que vêm sendo feitas, e aí eu vou passar agora para a professora Arti, que ela vai começar, e lembrando a todos que essa parte da palestra será feita em inglês. Art, por favor, please, Art.
Thank you, Guido. I'll be continuing off from where Guru left us. My name is Arti Ramesh. I am an assistant professor at State University of New York at Binghamton. I'm really excited and very, very happy to be doing this here with you, and I'll be continuing off where Guru left us and talking a little bit about characterizing human mobility patterns during COVID-19 using cellular network data. Specifically, we are looking at answering these 4 research questions with our work here. So Guru mentioned the individual and aggregate data set, and you know that there are different phases of the pandemic, which is before the lockdown period, during the lockdown period, and after the lockdown period. So we have data, fortunately, from all these 3 phases of the pandemic, and we are going to understand how user connectivity and mobility is different in these different phases. So the first question that we are going to ask and answer is that which antennas or which locations corresponding to the antennas have the maximum user connectivity and traffic, and how do they vary with the different phases of the pandemic? And the next question is, what percentage of users are mobile, stationary, and how does that vary with the different phases of the pandemic? Again, the next question is that if user mobility changes, does it change with the day of the week, and how does it vary again with the different phases of the pandemic? And the last question is, what antennas in each region attract the maximum number of users in a week, and how do they vary with the different phases of the pandemic? So regions, some regions we know attract more traffic, some regions attract less traffic. So we want to distinguish and see if there are possibilities where we can have lockdowns which are specific to regions, which are not blanket lockdowns, which have not been very popular in many countries during this pandemic. So first off, let's start with the connectivity analysis that we did. And the connectivity analysis here is during lockdown. So during lockdown, we have on figure graph on the right, we have the red line. So that is the line which we are seeing before lockdown. So before lockdown, the top 10% of antennas in Rio de Janeiro actually have this kind of pattern where they have this much load, the red line. And the blue line actually is the top 10% of antennas during lockdown. So during lockdown, we see that the top 10% of antennas actually take more load, more traffic than the top 10% of antennas before lockdown. So this suggests that there are some other antennas coming into play. Some of the antennas are taking more traffic. So that is, again, one thing to understand, especially if we are going to have specific lockdowns, also manage traffic across the city. And another thing that we noticed is that the performance of the antennas before lockdown changes during lockdown. So the magenta line gives us, so it's actually zigzag because it's the same antenna that is before lockdown. So now during lockdown, it has a different amount of traffic. So we can see that some of these magenta lines are going down, and we have marked them as red dots. So those red dots are antennas that got removed from the top 10%. So these are actually not gathering as much traffic as they used to before lockdown. So during lockdown, these antennas are not used as much. So that is what we actually again depict in the map down on the bottom right. So that there we can see the red, again the red spots and the blue spots. So the red spots or the red locations are locations from where the antennas are actually getting dropped out of the top 10%. So those antennas are not really gathering so much traffic during lockdown, so they are going away from top 10%. Instead of the red antennas, the red locations, new locations actually are emerging, and those are indicated in the blue locations. The blue are where people are going or where people are during lockdown. So they're moving away from the red locations and they're going to the blue location. So this is again something indicative of how mobility patterns are changing during the lockdown. And some people are working from home, maybe they're not going out as much, so they're going more of the traffic is now spreading into the suburban regions. Now we conduct a similar analysis comparing before lockdown to after lockdown. So again, here we see that the percentage of traffic of antennas after lockdown, which is given by the blue dashed line. So again, this is higher than the total percentage of traffic of antennas before lockdown. So what happens is that, again, we can see that there is some change here. Some antennas are gathering more traffic, and we want to understand which ones, and that's when we actually looked at the magenta line. So the magenta line are the same antennas in before lockdown, but their position is changing. Some of them are actually not gathering as much traffic, so they're getting left out of top 10%. So those are again in the red dots, and those red dots and the blue ones, blue stars, are the newly added antennas that come in the top 10% after lockdown. So we can say that even after lockdown is eased, things don't get back to full 100%. And it actually, we can see that very clearly in the mobility patterns, where some antennas still are not actually getting the same amount of traffic they used to before lockdown, and new areas are emerging. So again, looking at the locations on the bottom right, we can see that the red locations and the blue locations again. So the red locations are the locations that got left out in the top 10%, and the blue are the ones that actually emerged in the top 10%. So now we can see again that there is actually even more blue that actually emerges, more widespread emergence of blue after lockdown. And the ones that get kicked out of the top 10%, the locations in the red, correspond mostly to the downtown areas. So you're probably more well-versed about the geography of Rio, but this, I think, around this here is the downtown, and the most of the businesses are in this area, and since they could be still closed and majority of people may be working from home, it is going more to the suburban regions. Now we are looking at the user mobility analysis. Now this was conducted in the individual data set. So when actually Guto talked about the aggregate data set and the individual data set, you would have noticed that the individual data set is not from the same date. It does not start from the same date as the aggregate data set. A few weeks into the aggregate data set, the individual data becomes available. So we here start our analysis from week 6, if you see. The initial part is not available. So only from week 6 we are able to analyze this data. And most of this data is actually from during lockdown, well into lockdown, and also after lockdown. So when we analyze the data during lockdown, we can see that the number of users with no mobility continues to decrease. That's the red bar here that continues to sort of decrease a little bit. So which means that more and more people are going a little up. So what we did here is that what is the percentage of people that have different mobility, like more no mobility, low mobility, medium mobility, and then high mobility. So low mobility, if no mobility is a little decreasing, then people from no mobility group are going into low mobility, or low mobility people could be going into medium mobility or high mobility. So we are trying to see where actually this shift starts to happen. So we can see a more predominant shift somewhere here in week 9. After week 9, we can see that there's the medium mobility sort of increases. We are looking at the pink bar on the bottom right graph. So the pink bar sort of increases after week 9. So these are signs that people may be venturing out of their home even during lockdown. And this is something that we've been saying again and again in this data set. After a few weeks into the lockdown, we are seeing that slowly the mobility actually sort of increases. So now continuing where we left off, we looked at during lockdown. So when we are looking at after lockdowns, that is week 14 and out, 14 to week 18, we can see that again, number of users with no mobility decreases further. So here we can see a more marked decrease. So in the red bars, we can see the the decrease is more prevalent. And we can again see a very similar corresponding increase in the pink bars on the bottom right graph. So where the medium mobility increases. So because no mobility actually decreases, medium mobility has to sort of increase because we have the same, almost the same percentage of users in this study, right? And we also see that here high mobility actually increases more predominantly than during lockdown. So during lockdown, we don't see that much of a change in high mobility, but here after lockdown, we see a more pronounced change in high mobility. So now we want to see how people are moving throughout the city. So for that, we actually constructed a graph based on cell phone usage. So in the individual data set, we have the anonymized data of each user using their cell phone at different parts in the city. So what we did essentially was we constructed mobility events in the form of a graph. So when a user uses their mobile phone at some point to connect to either the data or text or make a phone call, so we actually get that record the user at that antenna, the closest antenna which is being used. And then when the user surfaces somewhere else in the city, then we actually make a path between the 2 points where the user has been connecting to use the cell phone. So we have an edge there. So we have nodes that are the antennas and the edges that run between them. So we actually mark the mobility events like this in this graph. And using this graph, this mobility graph that we built, we are actually going to continue our analysis. And first off, we are asking this question of how many total number of mobility events are people making. So if people are connecting, if the same cell phone is connecting to 2 different antennas, we consider that sort of a mobility event. So how many mobility events are occurring? So here we can see something very interesting from just the total number of mobility events. So week 13 here, the orange line, the dotted line, marks where lockdown ends in Rio, is eased, the restrictions are eased, but even before that, we can see an increase in mobility. So the curve definitely starts to turn even before the lockdown actually is eased. And then after the lockdown is eased, it continues to increase for the rest of the data, almost the rest of the data that we have. So now this is an indication that there is this phenomenon that's going on, not just in this data, but around the world that we hear about the news, gets talked about, that sort of has a social, people are socially relaxing rules because lockdown is just too much to take. And that's not just in one place, not just in data, it is everywhere that we have heard about this. So that phenomena is also there in this data. So it's actually interesting to see how this has implications for future managing of pandemic, of the same pandemic or any other pandemic, how to impose lockdowns or measures such that people adhere to them better, because that such blanket lockdown measures have not been really that helpful. So is there something better that we could do? So that is the question that has been motivated us throughout the study. So that's why I'm just trying to keep bringing that up, so you keep that in mind. So in continuing the graph-based mobility analysis, we want to see how, again, how mobility patterns are different across different days of the week. So now this is during lockdown, week 6 to 7 to week 12 to 13, and then week 14 to 18 is after the lockdown is eased. So now we can see here that there is a specific phenomenon that that pops out. So the blue bar is Fridays. So initially in week 6, 7, in the peak of lockdown period, we actually see that Fridays do not have too much traffic when compared to the weekdays of Monday to Thursday. But as actually lockdown progresses, we can see that Friday is the maximum amount of mobility. So because Fridays have people going to work, and also people may be participating in recreational activities, it could be that those are getting resumed week 8 to 11, 12 to 13, so it has the maximum amount of activity in a week. And similarly, we can see that the red bars Monday to Thursday, it actually remains higher than than the weekend, definitely Saturday and Sunday. The pink and the green bars are Saturday and Sunday. So red is definitely higher in all weeks, which means that some people do not have the luxury of working from home. So they may have to travel for work. So Monday to Thursday is definitely work part of the week. And if people are moving more during those days, it is possibly because of work. And that's something, again, to be keep in mind, that there are some jobs that don't have the remote work possibility, and they could actually be contributing to this higher amount of mobility on during Monday to Thursday. Another thing to notice here is that we have Saturday and Sunday, which generally have lesser mobility compared to Monday to Thursday or Friday. So for Saturday, we can see that in the map on the right, we can see how people are moving and where are they going on Saturday with respect to Monday to Thursday. So the red locations are the top locations Monday to Thursday, and the pink locations on the map on the right are the top locations for Saturday. So we can see that on Saturday, it is more in the suburban part, maybe people visiting friends or relatives, or places of worship, or they are actually at home in suburban neighborhoods, because that's basically where we can see more activity on Saturday. On Monday to Thursday, we can see the activity moves closer to the downtown area where businesses are usually located. And again, conducting a similar analysis or comparison between Monday to Thursday and Sunday, we can see that Sunday generally has the least amount of traffic, the least amount of mobility events in all of the days. And on Sunday, still we get similar locations compared to Saturday, more in the suburban parts, though in Monday to Thursday, the activity moves closer to the business areas, closer to downtown. Now, another thing that we wanted to do with the graph-based mobility analysis to understand per region how is the mobility. So now we have all the regions here on the x-axis here, and the weeks, the different weeks on the y-axis. So the scale gives us how many mobility events are there. So if there are too many mobility events, it's going to be dark red or going to black, approaching black, and green is giving us fewer mobility events. So there are patches of green and patches of red in the heat map that we have. So that is basically giving us just understanding of where the mobility events are. If it's dark green, then lowest mobility, medium green is low mobility, and orange or red is decent amount of mobility, and dark red is the most amount of mobility. So we can here our goal is to understand the relationship between the regions and their SPI, which again Guto talked about in the earlier part. So and the mobility events. So how are these connected? So now if we look at specific regions, SC, I think SC is Santa Cruz, CG, I forget what it is, but I'm sure that we can go back to the the graph that we have for SPI to understand what are these regions, there is like a legend there. So SC and CG have low SPI and they have high mobility. So generally, we saw that there are emerging correlations for this fact that lower SPI means that the jobs are more mobile, and they have to be mobile, and they have higher mobility during and after lockdown. And similarly, for regions with high SPI, such as BT and CE, I think they are closer to the downtown, and they have generally low mobility during and after the lockdown periods. And another thing that we noticed, which also, again, helps us understand the relationship between SPI and mobility better, is that JA, which has a combination of high and low mobility. I think there's an area within JA which has lower SPI. So we can see that in our heat map, it has a combination of higher and lower mobility, which means that there are pockets of probably pockets of people who have to travel for work, while simultaneously there are others who may not have to and have the luxury of working from home. So that is the characterizing mobility part. And now over to Professor Anand Seetharam for continuing the talk. Thank you again for having me.
So, hi everyone. Just trying to figure out if I will share my screen. I think to share screen currently because I lost some permission here. So I think maybe we have to add Arti back so that she can share the screen. Because our slides are exactly the same. So can everybody hear me? I think we have to add Arti back.
Hello, Art.
Hey.
Oh, Anand. Hey. So you asked Simone to put Art's screen back. Okay, Simone, can you just include Art's screen so she can manage Anand's slides? Is this one yours?
This
okay
one.
Now I think it's okay.
I think this one's not my screen. I believe this is Arti's screen. So
yeah. So Art, can you manage or pass the slides?
Yeah, I can manage.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'll just continue from where Arti left off. So there's a question from Fabrizio in the chat asking how we can use the mobility patterns that we're discerning to predict COVID-19 and how that is different from using car traffic data. So the first part of my talk would actually answer the first part of the question, like how we actually use the human mobility for predicting the COVID-19 cases. And regarding the second part of the question as to how it is different from car traffic data, and the main difference, I believe, is that it's easier to collect this kind of data because everybody is using a cellular phone and they're moving around, so it's easier to get that data. But if you have to get data from cars, we'll have to instrument that kind of setup to be able to collect data from traffic. But even with that data, we could, if you have the access to that data, we could use that to predict COVID-19 cases. So moving on to the next slide. Yes, so I have to every time go back because whenever Arti, I think, changes slides, I can't just see anything on my screen. It's a big blank screen. So this slide here, what we have is the number of connections and the number of mobility events versus the number of weeks. The main difference between the weeks on the x-axis here and the weeks that we have been seeing in the previous slides when Guto and Arti were presenting is that this is data from individual connections. So we have that data we only have around from the 5th of April. And because of that, what we have is these weeks are different from the weeks that were shown in the previous slides. Here, week 1 starts from April 5th. So, but the red line that we have here, the dotted red line, it is still the period when the lockdown ends. So from this figure, what we can see is the blue line corresponds to the number of connections, and as Guto and Arti discussed, the number of connections start to increase even before the lockdown is eased, and that's what we can see here. And the number of mobility events also start increasing even before the lockdown is eased. So, and they just continue to increase after the lockdown is eased. Okay? And the average number of mobility events is around 85 million during lockdown, and it increases to around 99 million after the lockdown is eased. So, Arti, if you can go to the next slide. So now the whole idea of trying to study human mobility is to use human mobility to understand the spread of COVID-19 and possibly come up with some kind of recommendations that can be used to implement some kind of lockdown measures to limit the spread of the disease. So this is COVID-19 data during the lockdown and after lockdown. Here, the date, what we can see is we have data till end of October. So COVID-19 is present, it starts increasing in the beginning of March, and after that it is steadily present. And the number of cases increase from during lockdown to the after lockdown period, and there's a 33% overall increase after the lockdown is eased, particularly because of the fact that when the lockdown was first implemented, what happened is the cases were still rising, but they continued to spread. And after the lockdown was eased, I think more mobility, more lack of social distancing, all that just made sure that the number of cases remained high. So, Arti, next slide, please. So our goal here after studying all this mobility is twofold. First, we want to design some analytical models to quantify human mobility. So far, what Arti and Guto showed you are visualizations and data science, the data science aspect of understanding how people are moving, but we now want to construct some analytical models to quantify this. After that, we would like to use these analytical models and combine them with the COVID-19 case information to predict cases in the future. So that is the ultimate goal of this project. So, and we have taken the first step in that direction with the help of these two studies. Arti, next slide, please. Okay. So what we do as a first attempt is we design a simple Markov model for quantifying human mobility. I know that a lot of you who are already listening to this talk might be thinking of a variety of different models that you could construct from this data for for identifying and quantifying human mobility. We start out with a simple Markov model, and we see in our work that the simple Markov model, when combined with the number of cases, is pretty good at predicting the cases in the future. Of course, this is not to say that we cannot come up with more sophisticated models, but as a first pass, we look at Markov models. Now, the thing is, when we have a Markov model like the one shown on your slide, what we can see is we have to first determine the states of this Markov chain. Now, we have roughly 1,400 antennas all spread all around the city of Rio and its suburbs. So if we consider each antenna to be a state of the Markov chain, to correspond to a state of a Markov chain, there would be a state space explosion, because there would be a lot of, the transition matrix would be like 1,400 cross 1,400. So it's pretty hard and it would not be useful. So instead, we once again look at this map of Rio, and what we do is we take each of these regions or municipalities in Rio, and I map them to a state in the Markov chain. And the good part about doing this is, if we come up with any kind of policy, the lowest granularity at which we could implement any kind of policy would be at the municipality level. So identifying each municipality as a state of the Markov model also makes sense from that perspective. Additionally, the cases that we have are generally at the municipality level, so it is easier to operate at that scale as well. So we design the Markov model such that each state of the Markov chain corresponds to a state of the municipality. So so here we have 27 municipalities, so there are 27 states in the Markov chain. Now we'll look at the user transitions. So we go through the trace, and here is an example of a trace. Say if it's for a particular user, say the user is in CE, which is central, then the user transitions to another antenna, which is also located in central, and then from central the user moves to BT and to an antenna in BT, and then from BT the user moves to an antenna in MA. Okay, so if this is the trace, what we do is we use that to construct the transitions in the Markov model. So if the transition occurs between two antennas in the same region, that corresponds to a same state transition. So in the user trace, if a movement between CE and CE is essentially due to the fact that the user is moving between two antennas in CE. When the user moves between CE and BT, that means the user has moved from an antenna that is located in CE to an antenna that is located in the BT region. So this is essentially how we determine design the Markov model and determine the transition probabilities of the Markov model from the data itself. So this essentially gives us the entire or everything that we have to know about this Markov model. Arti, next slide, please. So next, what we do is with the Markov model, the next goal is to figure out how to predict the cases. So what we do is we determine the transition probabilities of the Markov chain on a weekly basis. So every week we determine the transition probabilities, and this is how we envision our work to be used, is that you use the Markov model, which is essentially captures the mobility in the previous week. And then you look at the number of cases that are there in the different regions for that week. And using the number of cases that are there in the different regions and this mobility pattern, we would like to predict the cases for the future. So here in this slide, CJT plus 1 is essentially the number of cases in some region J in the week T plus 1. And Pij, with T in parentheses, Pijt is essentially the transition probability from I to state J. So we're looking at the transitions from any state I to this state J, and we're looking at the number of cases that are there in the ith region. So we're looking at transitions from all of these I's to the state J. So that is what Pij and CIT capture. So you're looking at how people are moving from region I to region J, and what are the cases that are currently being reported in region I. So what the rationale behind designing such a model is that what we assume is when people move from a region, say I, to a region J, and if the number of cases in region I is higher, then moving to region J would also have this trickle effect that they will carry the cases to region J and increase the cases in region J in the next week. So that is essentially how we are thinking about this. So the first model that we design is a simple linear model. Once again, many of you might be thinking of complex models. Of course, we could design complex models, but as a first step, we decided to do simple models. Multiple reasons why simple models are useful. One is they're easy to explain, just like what I'm trying to do here, and they're also easy to run. They don't require too much computational capability, and therefore we expect that something like this could be easily adopted by government officials. So if you give them something like a black box which they don't understand, it might just be harder to implement such things in practice. So now, because this is a linear model, what we have is we take PIJT with CIT, which is basically the cases in region I and the transition from region I to region J. With this product, we sum over all the regions. So it essentially captures the cases in all the regions that are there in Rio and how the mobility from those regions to this end region, which is J, is impacting the cases in J. And because it's a linear model, we have the slope and intercept of this line. So it's a very simple linear model, and this is what we use to predict the cases for the next week. Next slide, Arti. So, of course, if you can think of a linear model, the next step is to think of a polynomial model. So there is no reason to believe that we can't construct a polynomial model. So a polynomial model would be very similar, just that instead of having just the slope and the intercept, there would be higher order polynomial terms like square and cubed and so on and so forth. So once again, this is a model. So if some people are thinking that why we have a linear and a polynomial model, we're using the models. What we're trying to do is we're trying to understand how cases in the future can be predicted. And while a linear model is easy to explain, a polynomial model generally gives better prediction capabilities. So we have this polynomial model, and here the M0, M1 up to Mn are essentially the coefficients of the different polynomials. Arti, next slide. So now that we have designed our models, the next is to see how they work in practice. So let's look at some experimental results. So first, what we will do is we'll validate the Markov model, look at how the Markov model actually performs in practice and see if the design of the Markov model is good enough and whether it captures the mobility. And then we will see how our predictions are. So next slide, please. So here, this is we're looking at the transition probability for a particular region, of transition probability for a particular week. And what we have here is, what we can see is that some western regions at Santa Cruz and Campo Verde, they have high transition probabilities to the neighboring region. So there's this pattern that kind of starts emerging, which just means that some regions, they have transitions close to high transition probabilities to neighboring regions, and they have low transition probabilities to further away regions. Similarly, central zones like Central, CE, and PO have high transition probabilities to northern zones. Of course, they have high transition probabilities to themselves, but they also have high transition probabilities to them. We also see this kind of behavior being reciprocated, which means that the northern zones also have high transition probabilities to the central zones. And this is just the picture for a single week, but we saw this kind of behavior for all the other weeks as well. Arti, next slide. So now, if what we did here in this slide is we're looking at the one-step transitions, but we're looking at all the weeks. So it's one-step transitions in and out of central. So we want to see if from which regions we have lots of traffic into central, and similarly from which regions we have a lot of traffic out of central. So we observe that, so the darker the line, so basically dark red, black, those means high probabilities of entering into that region, into central from that region, and out of central from that region, based on which graph you're looking at. There's one on the left which shows you the one-step incoming transition probability into central, and the one on the right shows the outgoing transition probability from central. Now, the probability of getting into central from its neighbors is SC neighbors, which is ST, RC, and PO. Once again, I don't remember what those regions are. I've tried to understand the geography of Rio well, but somehow I keep forgetting. And similarly, some northern zones like TI, VI, IG, the probability of getting into central from these regions is pretty high. Now, similarly, the outgoing probability from C to regions like LA, MA, ME, BO, and CO is higher than the incoming probability from those regions to central. So kind of people from central, or like people who visit central, are more go to these regions, but they don't come back into central with the same probability. So maybe they take some other route to go home, because some of them, I think CO is some of them have beaches. So it could be that people are going from there to the beaches. So this is kind of showing us is we can have these islands or group of islands which are closely connected to each other. So by understanding this kind of mobility pattern, what we hope to achieve is not just like predictions, which we will see in a couple of slides from now, but we also want to know is that if there's high mobility between a couple of regions, and say in future, even once the pandemic dies down, say one region has an increase in the number of cases, then we know by looking at this mobility pattern that it is just not enough to maybe lock down that one region and hope that the pandemic would go away. It's not likely to happen, simply because there is this kind of high mobility in and out of those regions. But another thing also that we can understand is you could maybe decouple regions that don't have high mobility into one another. So for example, the amount of mobility from places like Santa Cruz and Campo Verde, which are on the west side of Rio, into central is much less. So for example, if there is an increase in the number of cases in central, it might be just prudent to lock down central and its neighboring regions, and you could still let people in Santa Cruz and Campo Verde go about doing their own business, simply because there is not too much mobility between those two regions. And because people are we're very unhappy with blanket lockdown, so coming up with something that is less intrusive might be something that people would like, and that would be helpful for also keeping the economy rolling. Arti, next slide, please. So here what we did is another way to actually look at whether the Markov chain model is good is we compared the steady state performance of the Markov model. What we saw is on the left, we have the empirical approach, where we basically, what we did is we take the observations and construct the transition probability of the Markov model. And then from there, from using the transition probability matrix, we then compute the steady state. It is basically take the matrix and raise it to a high power, all the rows would just become the same. Now on the right, which we have true observations, we basically just go ahead and look at the number of times users visit particular regions. So that is basically true observations. Now what we can see from this particular figure is that the colors match very closely, and it's not just the colors. We'll have looked at the absolute numbers. The absolute numbers match very closely. So what we can say is the steady state performance of the Markov model is pretty good, and the true observations and that obtained from the empirical approach match well. Okay, next slide, please. So here we once again try to validate the Markov model. So on your left, we have the steady state performance for a particular week. What we can see is the blue line are the true observations, the red are the empirical ones. Along the y-axis, we have the probabilities. Along the x-axis, we have all the different regions. So it's a steady state. And we can see that on the graph on the left that the bars match pretty well, which just means that the empirical approach of determining a transition matrix and then finding out the steady state matches very closely with the ground truth. Now on the right, we also try to see the transient state performance. So we looked at two-step transition probabilities and compared them with the ground truth. We can see that the Markov model works reasonably well for a two-step transition probability. It does not match as well as a steady state probability. A couple of reasons is that as we go further into the future, the Markovian assumptions don't hold true. That could be one reason. Another thing that is important to understand is regarding the true observations. To figure out two-step transitions from the true observations, when we're going through the trace, we have to, if we encounter a state like the last two states in a string for a particular user, we cannot determine where the user went beyond that because we don't have the data. So that is another reason that we believe why we have this kind of discrepancy. But our steady state performance is pretty good. And having validated the Markov model, and we feel confident that it is a pretty good model to model the mobility, or what we were going to see next is how we can use the Markov model to predict the number of cases in the future. So Arti, next slide, please. So here, what we have is, we look at the prediction we are going to look at for 4 regions. So in this slide, we have 2 regions which have low and fair SPI. And in the next slide, we'll look at 2 regions with higher SPI, which just says that we are looking at the entire spectrum of all the regions to see how we are predicting. So the red line is essentially how the number of cases are changing, and we compare. So our model is mobility aware, right? We're using mobility and we're constructing a linear and a polynomial model. So to compare it with the baseline that we consider is a mobility agnostic model. That is a model that does not take into account any kind of mobility. So we just look at a simple linear regression model, which is a line that is fit through all these points, which is, I think, one of the most simple models that have been widely used to understand how cases are going to increase in the future, provided you are not using any additional information other than the number of cases. And the blue and green lines on the green and black lines, sorry, on the screen, they are our mobility aware. Green is the mobility aware linear model, and the black is the mobility aware polynomial model of order 3. So we only look at polynomial models of orders 2 and 3 because beyond that, it would be too much of overfitting the data. Now, without going into too much numbers, what we did is we compared the performance in terms of metrics like root mean squared error, mean absolute error, relative error. These are all standard metrics that are used to compare errors. And what we found is that our models consistently beat the baseline, which is the mobility agnostic model. One other thing that we saw, and that will also be clear when we look at the next slide, is regions with higher SPI have higher number of cases when compared to regions with lower SPI. Though we don't know the actual reason, this is a little puzzling because people with lower SPI generally do not have the luxury of working from home, so they have to go out to work. So we would expect that regions with lower SPI will have higher number of cases, but that's not what is being recorded. There could be many reasons. One reason could be that there is access to testing is lower in regions with lower SPI, that people who are less well off have less of access to good testing facilities. Arti, next slide, please. So this is 2 regions which have a better SPI. That is, there's Maya, which is ME, and BT, and we can see that our predictions are once again better. So that is the overall takeaway message, that the linear model and the polynomial models do better than the mobility agnostic model, and with, of course, the higher order polynomial model, which is the polynomial model of order 3, performing better than the polynomial model of order 2, which in turn performs better than the linear model. I think with this I will stop, and then I'll ask Guto to carry on from here about our future work. Guto, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry, thanks. So we are almost done with the presentation. So here is one slide with a few possibilities of future work, right? So one possibility of this future of this work as a be to use the cell network large to detect and inform agglomerations and lockdown violations, for example. The system or all the data that we have, we can formulate models that try to predict based on what we have learned, or, for example, to detect any kind of agglomeration and on kind of real time send some kind of information to administration or even to other people that's around that place to avoid that place because of the agglomeration. Another possibility of future work would be to try to correlate the mobility and or COVID-19 case information have data that we have analyzed from mobility, but we could use any kind of other data to try to understand or to give us some more idea in this kind of analysis. And for last, the other possibility would be to analyze the population mobility pattern change along the immunization period. Try to understand how the behavior of the population is changed along this period that we are going to start to live now with the immunization. Right? So with those three possible future works, we are basically done with our presentation, and we are open to questions. Again, I'd like to thank all the audience, and especially thank Anand and Art for sharing with me this work in this talk, and for the collaboration.
Thank you, Guto, for the opportunity.
Thank you, Guto. It was exciting to actually do this work. It's important, and I'm feeling really honored to have been able to participate in this with you.
Yeah, thanks. So guys, right now we have a few questions. Actually, we do have two questions here. The first one is this one in Portuguese. I'm going to translate. So the question is how the presented system or what we have presented can reduce the number of infection cases, or how this information could be important for decision taking decision for administrative municipality administration, for example. So some of you could answer this.
So maybe because I presented the third work on prediction, I'll just take that question. So
yeah.
So because our predictions were pretty good with respect to our model, what we can do is the goal is if we can predict cases, future cases well, that's what our model does. And assuming that once Brazil and all the countries around the world have the pandemic under some level of control, then even then we would need to be vigilant to prevent future waves of the pandemic. So this model can then guide authorities to figure out where and how to impose partial lockdowns instead of every time some cases pop up, not just either imposing blanket lockdowns or just letting it go. We can see that from which regions to which regions there is a lot of mobility, and then understand this, how regions are connected with respect to mobility, and then impose lockdowns which are like kind of for a few regions together, such that the disease is kind of contained in those regions and does not spread beyond that and just become the same global pandemic that we just have experienced.
Yeah, just to complete the answer, and I don't know about New York State or even in New York City, but it's not happening in Rio, but in São Paulo, which is a larger city, they are taking decision on lockdown, for example, based on the regions of the city, exactly what we have presented here, right? So this could be really helpful for the administration to take decisions.
So that's good. Just to add to that point, I think there was a similar step that was taken in New York as well. When the cases first appeared, they actually imposed lockdowns in a region just outside New York City called New Rochelle. That's where the lockdowns were first imposed. But I think our study goes a little further in that just imposing, like where the cases are, if you just impose the lockdown in that one region, it is not sufficient, right? Because movement from other regions into this one region has already happened, and vice versa. We may actually impose lockdowns proactively in a few other regions which are well connected to this region, because otherwise that trickle effect of cases, because if people move the last week, most likely cases are going to come up next week. So that is additional. I don't know how it's being done in Sao Paulo, but I don't think something like that has been used in the United States, that actually losing mobility to actually quarantine or lock down some regions.
Okay. So this is from Fabrizio that you know very well, right?
Yeah, it's like, yeah, that's Fabrizio. Like, yeah, we know him very well. Like, Fabrizio and I were like, we worked in the same lab during our PhD. So I think this is the question I answered before when I just started my portion of the talk, and I think Fabrizio just said thanks. So I think we don't have to explain this too much. I think that's what our part of the talk was. But maybe I think Arti, you can join and see what you think could be done differently with the car traffic data.
Yeah, I think that they have, like you were saying, there are a lot of similarities between the phone network and the car traffic data. And one other thing that, so generally the both are approximate in some ways. So like, for example, we are saying if the phone surfaces an area, we are establishing a path. Car traffic can sort of alleviate that, because maybe that's a destination where people are really going and not just using their phone at that point, but also are reaching a destination. So some of the continuous and the discreteness of the car traffic data, like for example, there's a continuous stream and then there is a stop and then that breaks up again. So that could actually help a little bit more, I think, but both of these are in some ways approximations, and that's something we have to keep in mind when we're analyzing it. And the idea is to not have a perfect understanding of mobility in some ways, but see how that can help give us ideas for lockdown. So that is, we are using that as a proxy to study and understand lockdown, if it makes sense. So that's probably what I would add.
Okay, Art. Thank you very much. I think we are done with the questions. I think, yeah, those are the 2 questions. There are some people just congrating for the talk and for the work, and thanks for all the answers. So I have 2 questions, 1 question and 1 comment. The first one is, I mentioned about the possibility of using social network data to include in this kind of analysis, but is there any other suggestions from your side that it could be useful? For example, perhaps there are some professors here that has access to data. What kind of data could be useful to put together in those kind of analysis? Do you have any kind of suggestion?
Arti, you can go ahead with the kind of current work that you're doing. Maybe.
Right. So, we've been collecting data from Twitter, social media, to understand what people are talking about, and we've had specific themes for collecting the data. So one theme, initially we were looking at lockdowns and how people felt about the lockdowns, and we have branched out from there to study specific situations within that COVID-19 has created. So for example, how that actually affects unemployment, how that affects immigration, how that affects vaccination and how people are talking about vaccination. So all of these things are something that we are studying using social media. So I think that I think combining these two studies could be potentially very, very powerful. For example, people may be talking about in social media where they are going. So there are also social media apps that actually record locations. So some of those things, when they come together, they could become really powerful and have another way of even verifying our work or combining it to make it more legitimate. So that is one idea that could be done, I think. Any other thoughts?
So another thing that I was thinking is like in a non-intrusive manner, right? Like from self-revealed information, just like what Arti was saying. So, so that is Twitter and Facebook are one set of places where people disclose what they're doing. So if that is the route that we are going to take, then people also are likely to put up information on whether they got vaccinated. There are people who are very vocal about whether they got like whether they had pizza last night, so they're pretty sure they put up vaccination information on the web. So we could use that and see, and that could help us understand the spread better, right? Because if somebody has gotten vaccinated, though vaccination is not 100% guaranteed, we could kind of and we're looking at the mobility of that individual. Maybe that individual, we can lower down the kind of the spread capability of that individual. In comparison, if there is somebody who's reluctant to take the vaccine for some reason, then their risk is pretty high to themselves and to society in general, simply because of their reluctance to whatever reason they are. So if that is one way, that if we have that kind of information, because we have the cellular data for those people, and assuming that each user uses at least one kind of social network, and a significant portion of them also so either talk positively about vaccinations or negatively, or some of them even claim whether they've gotten it or not, then we could use that information going forward, combined with this kind of their own cellular locations and mobility, to figure out how the spread would happen going further. Because we can't expect that the whole entire population will get vaccinated, even if we have vaccines, and even if everybody gets vaccinated, they're like the cases will keep coming up in some way. And another way is, I think China has done this, and I think Denmark has proposed this, to get like this COVID digital, I think, passport. So if they get that kind of passport information, then with that we could correlate this, because if they make a passport, right, then that would be public information, like who got the passport. Whether that's possible or not is another question. Whether they get that, then we could use that once again to see which people are less risk to society and with respect to spreading the disease, and which people are more susceptible to spreading the disease. So we could also look at that.
Okay. So, and then Art, again, thank you very much for the talk. Before you finish, and I give you the speech for final remarks. Let me ask you to mention to the audience if they are interested in working with you, and what can you say about the university. So take just a few words about your work pointers and the university.
Sure. So we pretty much maintain our web pages where all our information are available, the kind of work that we do. So I have a lab web page where I have information about students who have graduated, students currently working with me, and also the kind of work that we are doing, the projects, ongoing projects, and all our papers that you find from there. So those are, I think, the best places to know more about the work that we've done in this space. And there are actually more work that we have done here and also elsewhere, which could be relevant for the COVID situation. And going forward, we'll be working on other exciting projects as well. So please look at them. And I think that if you actually you can find us by name saying Binghamton. I think it should lead us to my Arti Ramesh. Binghamton should lead you to my webpage, and you can find the lab webpage through that. And similarly, Professor Seetharam can also has a lab webpage, which he will tell you about.
Yeah, so the only thing, exactly what Arti said, you could find my lab web page, my own homepage. Both of them are reasonably well maintained, except for this last work that we presented. One of them is an archive, but the other work is not. Both of them have not been published, so we haven't put them up on the web. But everything else that has been accepted and published, all the papers are available. And the only difference, I think, if you go is my work is more systems and more networking, and Arti's work is more data science, machine learning, so that kind of direction. So that's why we all collaborated, because we started off by looking at the data, then we did some simple modeling, and I think as future work on the same data, we are trying to look at some kind of clustering and see more advanced ML approaches. So I think Binghamton has a master's program and a PhD program, so the students who are interested, you can apply to these programs, and then the general approach of getting selected would go on from there, but that's the approach. That's the way to go forward.
Yeah, and also our contact information should be available on our on the webpage. So if you have any questions, you can just email us directly. And I also want to add that I also have a lab account on Twitter where we post exciting stuff that's happening on our lab work that we are doing. So if you're interested, please look at that. We also have YouTube channels where we post videos on educational videos on many topics. I have videos on machine learning. Professor Seetharam has videos on algorithms, data structures, and many things, computer science. We also actually talk about some of our research there. So that's another place where you could actually find more information about our work.
I think that is good. I think with respect to students, I think that's one of the most important resources. With this pandemic, we just decided to make all our classes like the video, the material for our classes online. So it's not just recorded videos from our classes. What we did was we made those videos separately and we put them up. So they're in English. So some students might find it a little difficult, but I think Google has some good translations, and like YouTube, so you could use that. And I think that would be a good place for all students, particularly undergraduates and like master's students, to just revisit some of the material that has been taught in class.
And we have a joint educational initiative, which is called csradio4all.org. So we have most of our material links posted there on our website, which we maintain. So that's another place to look for educational content that we just create as part of our work and related to our research and expertise.
Okay, Art, Anand, thank you very much. Has been a pleasure for me to collaborate with you, with the students as well. And thank you for giving us this talk.
I think thank you for the opportunity for collaboration. And I'm pretty sure that we'll have a few more interesting papers that we're already doing lined up, which will get done. And I think that we can then come back to something like this and do another presentation for the audience.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Guy. So, bye-bye. Bye, Art. Bye, Anand. Bye-bye. Thank you, everybody. Muito obrigado a todos pela audiência, pela presença. Qualquer pergunta, dúvida, vocês podem entrar em contato comigo ou com qualquer um dos outros dois professores. E, sem dúvida, será um prazer responder por e-mail. Até mais.